Thank you for joining us. The Maytree Foundation is dedicated to reducing poverty, and so we are particularly delighted to host this webinar, which goes to the heart of some of the systemic solutions to generational poverty in this country. As you'll hear from May, there are 900,000 children across the country who are not getting a grant of up to $2,000 from the government for their education. This money, which has already been set aside for them and been provided for in our federal budget, could change their lives. Children from low-income families, we know, with even small amounts of savings, are more likely to apply and graduate from university. May has a number of important recommendations to present to you. The most important, we think, is the recommendation that government automatically deposit the bond for low-income families into an RESP. The government already knows who these families are and how to reach them, because eligibility for the bond is tied to receipt of the child tax benefit. There is a model here in Ontario that could be duplicated. The provincial government, for instance, already opens an RESP for Crown wards. But this recommendation is one of many that May will describe to you, and it is therefore my pleasure to introduce to you May Wong, the Executive Director of the Omega Foundation, which designed and has led the campaign on the SmartSaver Education Savings Initiative. Prior to joining Omega, May was Vice President, Community Initiatives of the Toronto Community Foundation. She also created and managed grant programs at the Toronto Atmospheric Fund and the Ontario Trillium Foundation. Wong has advised public policy and sector planning on environmental, arts, and child development issues. She's a member of the Board of Directors of the Canadian Urban Institute and Diaspora Dialogues, and is a member of the Steering Committee of the Environics Institute's Urban Aboriginal People Study. Welcome, May.
Thank you very much, Ratna. And thank you to all of you for connecting this morning for this presentation. We're going to talk about free money. For those of you from outside the Toronto area, I just ask that you excuse the fact that a number of the examples used in this presentation are Toronto-focused. SmartSaver, the project upon which this presentation is based, is a Toronto-focused program. The photo that is before you right now is a photograph of Jasmine Wilson. She is the proud new investor in an RESP and the recipient of a Canada Learning Bond for her daughter Anaya. Though some would say that Jasmine is not your typical 18-year-old, when you talk to her about her hopes and her concerns for her child's future, she talks like a typical parent. Because what we know is that parents have high hopes for their children. This recent study from the Toronto District School Board surveyed the parents of over 90,000 elementary school-age children. It demonstrates that the vast majority of parents, regardless of income and education level, recognize the importance of post-secondary education for their children's futures. We know that parents' expectations have a significant influence on children's educational pursuit. But a large proportion of low-income parents will not realize that goal. Youth from low-income families are less likely than higher-income youth to attend post-secondary, even when their grades are excellent and their parents consider education a priority. Over 50% of students from the highest income quartile go to university. Less than 30% from the lowest quartile go. This is a waste of talent and potential. And it's not just the individuals who lack the opportunity of higher education that pay the price. The additional social and health costs attributed to low educational attainment are very significant. As Senator Hugh Segal recently said, dropouts are mostly from poor families, and every dropout weakens Canada's competitiveness. And yet, a small investment in children's education futures from a younger age can turn this around. Youth who have some savings put aside for their post-secondary education are 50% more likely to actually go. Studies show that close to 90% of parents plan to pay all or part of the cost of their child's post-secondary education, but a large proportion don't know how they will actually do that. The federal government's programs for education savings were created to fill this need. The basic tool is the Registered Education Savings Plan, which is a tax-sheltered savings account. The Canada Education Savings Grant is a matching incentive to motivate families to contribute into that RESP. The Canada Learning Bond, introduced in 2004, is a contribution into the RESP of a low-income child in recognition that many low-income parents do not have the resources to contribute themselves into the education savings accounts of their children. But families in the top income quartile are more than 3 times as likely to have RESPs than those with lower incomes. The matching grants disproportionately benefit wealthier families. The Canada Learning Bond, which offers a starting point for families who can't afford to make their own contributions, has fallen far short in its benefit to low-income children in every year since its introduction in 2004. As HRSDC in its own evaluation of its programs reported last year, there has not been a significant change in the share of lower-income RESP subscribers since the inception of the Canada Learning Bond. Now, a number of barriers stand in the way of low-income families taking part in benefiting from education savings programs. First and foremost is low awareness. These are the levels of awareness that we found in a sample of 300 families surveyed in low-income neighborhoods in Toronto. A second significant barrier is product confusion. Families are often unaware that RESP products differ by provider and are unable to understand the costs, conditions, and potential risks associated with each RESP product, primarily because of how poor the product information is. Thirdly, the multi-step administrative process required to start an RESP can be a discouragement to some. Working backwards, an RESP cannot be registered without social insurance numbers for both the parent and the child who will benefit. This confirms their eligibility for government benefits. Getting a social insurance number requires a birth certificate. Now, an RESP can be started for free, and a social insurance number is also free. A birth certificate costs $25. But there are a number of very simple things that community service providers can do to ensure that low-income children get their bond and benefit from its motivational impact. First, you can become informed. You can inform yourself of what the RESP programs are, the way that the Learning Bond works, and how to advise your families, the families that you support, on how they can access it. And secondly, you can share that knowledge with families. And thirdly, you can help families to navigate the RESP enrollment process. Let's take these one by one. Becoming more informed. I encourage you first, read up. There are 2 great places that I would encourage you to look for information. canlearn.ca, which is the federal government's website, and our recently launched SmartSaver.org, which can be linked from canlearn.ca, which builds on the federal information with additional consumer-oriented tools and is available in multiple languages. Secondly, ask questions. Don't be afraid to ask the technical questions. There are many great sources for answers. This is only a small sample. HRSDC, Canada Revenue Service Canada. On top of this, the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada, the Ontario Securities Commission, many different organizations are ready to answer your technical questions about RESPs. Better awareness is critical to improving RESP enrollment. Please share what you know. Refer the families you deal with to credible information sources. I strongly recommend using SmartSaver.org, not only because families will find all of the government information there, but because they will find other user-friendly tools as well, and in 14 different languages. The more families see and hear information about RESPs and the Canada Learning Bond in familiar settings, the more they will trust these programs. Make RESPs visible in your centers. Have information on hand. Hang up a poster. And more than anything, please do talk to families about RESPs and the Canada Learning Bond. If we can get over our anxieties about talking about domestic violence, mental health, sexual orientation, and so many other sensitive issues, I think we can get over our anxiety about talking about money. It's not easy for any of us to believe that the Canada Learning Bond is actually free money, but it is. Families will be more likely to trust that if they hear it from people they trust. The best support that community service providers can give families to facilitate their RESP enrollment is to assist them to secure their social insurance numbers. Whether it's assisting them to read the form, to get through the ID requirements, directing them to a Service Canada office, organizing a group excursion, or hosting a mobile SIN clinic, it's important that parents be encouraged to get the SIN for their child. If applied for in person at a Service Canada office, the number will be generated on the spot, and that is good enough to take to the bank to start the RESP. There's no need to wait for the social insurance card. You can easily help families determine if they're eligible for the Canada Learning Bond. As long as their child was born in 2004 or later, and the family's net income is under $41,000, their child will receive the bond. Many families have received a letter from the government confirming their child's eligibility. And if families receive the National Child Benefit Supplement as part of their child tax benefit, their income is absolutely eligible. The SmartSaver project is here to help you. We are a 3-year Toronto-focused pilot testing different outreach and marketing approaches to increase participation in the Canada Learning Bond. In addition to the founding sponsors seen here, additional schools, childcare centers, community organizations are joining on every week for information they can pass on to their families about how to get the Canada Learning Bond. We want you to be successful in engaging families in RESPs. On the web, SmartSaver has created resources both for families through smartsaver.org and for frontline service providers through a members-only website. We have print resources for you. Besides distributing thousands of government brochures, we have created additional consumer-focused print pieces like the free money postcard, what we nicknamed the 2-minute workshop, and the posters that we will be circulating that provide real-life stories to reassure families that this is free money and it's easy to get. For those of you who live in Toronto or work in Toronto, we invite you to call us to access training. Our partner, the Working Women's Community Centre, is running agency outreach sessions around town to introduce service providers to RESPs, much as I'm doing now. For interested agencies, SmartSaver staff and YMCA of Greater Toronto staff provide on-site training for professionals to prep you to engage your families in RESP education. Since our launch in September, we've trained schools, child care centers, settlement organizations, parenting centers, language instruction programs, and others. The short-term benefits of improving low-income family participation in education savings programs include improving the reach of the Canada Education Savings Programs to those who actually need it the most, increasing financial literacy with hands-on practical financial education and experience, and motivation for low-income parents and children to see higher education as a realistic possibility. Long-term, we will improve children's likelihood of attaining post-secondary education, which will mean that their employment and earnings prospects will be improved. Their asset accumulation and financial stability will be improved over time. And in essence, we could break the cycle of poverty. the real value of improving the participation of low-income families in education savings, and in particular the Canada Learning Bond, is more than the money. It is the opportunity to engage and motivate lower-income families and students towards greater financial participation and higher learning. Low-income parents' determination to provide for their children's education is clear, and encouraging and facilitating their success and their children's enrollment will yield real economic and social returns. Thank you.
Thank you, May. We are doing great on time, and we have more time than we had scheduled for questions. So I'm going to add some questions of my own, if I may, and I'm going to start off with the obvious one. Last time I counted, thankfully my children are out of university, but if they were to go to university today, an undergrad degree in university, let's talk about universities, costs close to $8,000 to $9,000. Multiply that by 4 years without living costs, you're looking at least $30,000. So $2,000. What difference does it make? How does this really help?
I'm really glad that you asked the question about whether or not $2,000 makes a difference, because we actually get that question a lot when we go out to agencies. And the funny thing is that service providers ask that question, and parents never ask that question. When parents hear $500, not to say $2,000, they think it's worth getting. Service providers often will say, but it's only $2,000. You know, will that even make a dent? And I think that that speaks to part of the barrier that we identify through community service provision. Families aren't hearing about the program, partly because of some of the filtering that goes on among those who have access to that information. But to get back to your question, what is the impact of the $2,000? The reason that the Omega Foundation is so interested in the use of the Canada Learning Bond and why we consider it a priority is because of its potential to leverage so much greater impact and opportunity. We built this program on research that we then had families help us to verify. Starting at $500 and building its way towards $2,000, the bond is catalytic for financial literacy and engagement, and for setting the wheels in motion for a college-bound kid. I think that one of the mothers we worked with summed it up best when she said, I told my son I started an account that's only for your studies, so you better study. The bond motivates parents who are in prime position to motivate their children. On top of that, 94% of Canada Learning Bond recipient families contribute to their children's RESPs, even though they don't have to. That's a demonstration of the motivation to provide educational opportunity for their children. The money in an account in the child's name, earmarked for their education, it's a powerful motivator that improves the chance that that child is going to graduate from high school and pursue higher education. The Canada Learning Bond should definitely be accessed by all eligible families. Just because at the $2,000 level, it's funny, we do get that question. We did a little digging. We asked young people and we asked families, what do you consider high-paying occupations? We heard real estate agent, fashion designer, and investment professional. So we did some digging. Real estate agents training, $2,000. Investment managers training, $2,000. Fashion designer program, first year tuition is $1,500. And all of those can be enrolled in as long as the kid has a high school diploma.
That's a great answer. Can I just have because I think your examples of what kids aspire to be and what the bond covers is really wonderful. It costs $2,000, let's say, to become a real estate agent. But is that eligible education under the terms of the learning bond?
Yes. One of the things...
Because it's non-university or something like that, right?
Yes. One of the reasons that we are so supportive of the Education Savings Program is because qualifying education programs are so wide open. There are hundreds of qualifying educational organizations just here in Ontario. But it covers not only the traditional colleges and universities, but private colleges, trade schools, business schools, beauty schools, you name it. You can,
Okay.
yes, the list, the master list of qualifying educational opportunities that are covered by the Education Savings Program is very vast. Now, one of the things that is a differentiating factor between RESP providers and products is that some, like the RESPs provided by the banks, just follow the federal guidelines and are that broad. Other RESP products are narrower and are restricted to, say, full-time programs or only colleges and universities, but there's no reason for families to enroll in those and cut their children out of the opportunity to make vastly different decisions later.
I think I'm going to dig a little deeper there, but there are questions from the audience, and I want to turn to our audience, and I'm reading a question from a participant who wants to know, what are the options for families whose children are over 10 years old?
Yeah, and it's unfortunate how many times we'll be out in a community agency and the parent who comes up to us says, my child is 7. Because, of course, with the Canada Learning Bond having started in 2004, the children who are eligible for it are at most 6 years old this year. But for 7 and up, I mean, the thing is that the Education Savings Program can work for anybody. For low-income families, there are particular preferential benefits. The matching incentive, for instance, the Canada Education Savings Grant, the basic benefit for all families is 20%. But if you make between $41,000 and $80,000 in income, the benefit is added to with an extra 10%. If your net family income is under $41,000, the federal government adds an extra 20%. So it's a 40% match altogether for lower income families. So that means that even if you put in $10, the federal government will kick in another $4. One of the examples that we like to use in agencies, which we find a lot of parents, especially of younger children, can relate to, is the Happy Meal example. You take one Happy Meal a week, you add the matching component at 40%, you've got close to $500 a year. And a lot of parents say, well, it would be really easy to give up one Happy Meal a week.
Yes, this is, we have lots of questions coming in. Again, let's stick with the age. Here's a question from someone who says, let's say there is a family that's come to Canada, they're new to Canada, their child is 18 years old. Can they open an RESP?
An individual plan can be opened by anyone at any age. Yes, they can. What they can't do is access the bond or the matching components.
I see. And there's a question about how much money can one get from the Canada Learning Bond, this free money?
It maxes out at $2,000.
Total?
Yes.
Okay. And there's a question which I'm sure you hear a lot about. If a parent, let's say, saves, gets the Canada Learning Bond, does all the right things, and this child decides to follow his or her own path, do they lose the money?
Again, this is one of the differentiating aspects that I really encourage not only parents to know more about, but also service providers who support parents to know about the difference between one RESP product and another. It's really important for people to know what they're signing on to. Again, if you go with the bare bones bank RESP option, which follows the federal guidelines, no, the child does not lose anything if they decide, for instance, they finish high school and they want to travel the world, or they want to take some time out, go get a job for a while to try to figure out what they want to do. An RESP can be kept open for as long as 36 years. And I tell you, if my daughter hasn't figured out after 36 years if she's going to continue her education, then I think something needs to be addressed with it. If after the maximum amount of time with the RESP, the child who is no longer a child, at that point says, I truly am not going to want to pursue any education, then what happens is the Canada Learning Bond and any of the matching grants will have to be returned to the government, because then they can be recycled to help somebody else. The contributions that were made are returned to the subscriber anyways, and the growth that sat in the RESP, that's any interest, any investment earnings that accumulated in the RESP, can be redirected to another purpose.
Okay. So a lot of our participants are working in the community, advising clients, and one of the questions is around enrolling for the Canada Learning Bond and the Canada Education Savings Grants. Some bank officers inform clients about these and others don't. What can community workers, settlement workers, what should they do to ensure that the information is out there, that individuals are talking to their banks, etc.?
Well, one thing that we know is that for the most part, people are banked. I mean, the vast majority of families do have a bank. Whether or not they go in and have a relationship with the branch manager or not is a different thing, but they certainly have a bank that they're using for something. We absolutely recognize the issue of whether or not bank staff, the frontline staff in banks, are familiar enough with the Canada Learning Bond. You got to remember. The Learning Bond, over 6 years, has only benefited 200,000 children across the country. Chances of a branch officer having ever been asked for a Learning Bond are pretty slim. And so, sure enough, even our own staff and volunteers, we walk into branches all the time, and just for fun, we go up to the front, to the counter, and we ask, who do I speak to about a Canada Learning Bond? And it is not uncommon for us to hear, what is the Canada Learning Bond? So that's one of the reasons we're working with Royal Bank and Scotiabank as well. We're looking at what can be done in the branches to raise visibility. We're looking at, how do we help to spread the information? We've got to get it better information among parents so that they know to ask for it. We have to also make sure that the RESP providers are equipped to provide them with the proper service. One of the things, very simple tool that we do, we have thousands of copies of a federal government's flyer that talks about the Canada Learning Bond. And we're providing those to community agencies and just saying, whenever your parents want to go get one, tell them to take one of these flyers. It's a federal government flyer. Take it to the branch with you, and they'll know exactly what you're talking about.
Okay. Thank you. May, here's a question that's rather technical, but if May can't answer it, I'm sure we can find a way to get the answer to this individual. Is it possible to open an RESP if the bank has frozen your account for non-payment of bank fees?
I don't know.
We don't know that question, but we will try and get an answer to you later on. So I want to get back to something you referenced, and I think it deserves some digging into. You said that there are different kinds of RESP options. There's the global universal one where you open it with a bank, and your child can choose any of the options for education, including university, college, hairstyling, beauty salon, trades, private college, etc. And then there are limited option RESPs. Can you explain what they are and how they come about and what customers should know about them?
Sure. There are three basic types of RESP. There is the individual plan, which is, I think, the most flexible. It is the one that we emphasize the most with families, just because they are available everywhere, and they also provide the most flexibility in terms of who can contribute to it and what age it can be started at. The individual plan, you name one beneficiary, and it can be a beneficiary of any age. Also, anyone can start an individual plan for a child, and anyone can contribute to it. Secondly, there is the family plan. Now, this is preferred by a lot of families that have more than one child. The idea behind a family plan is it's like an individual plan in many ways, but you can name more than one beneficiary. They have to be related, but what it enables families to do is have one account that they contribute to whenever they can, or pool everything into one account for convenience sake. It also allows them to hedge their bets a little bit. If one child decides, I'm not going on to post-secondary, then the other children who are beneficiaries in the plan can just go ahead and use the assets that are in there. Everything except the Canada Learning Bond. The Canada Learning Bond is specific to an individual child. The third kind of RESP is called the group plan. A group plan it's kind of like an individual plan in that individual children are enrolled. However, it works on a very different model, where individual children are purchased units in almost like a mutual fund, which is shared by other children of their same age. The assets are pooled, they are invested together, and over time they grow, the unit values grow, and upon graduation from high school, all of the children who have units in this pooled plan share in the proceeds according to their units. These plans tend to have more costs and more restrictions associated with them, probably because, well, for a couple of reasons. One is they have so many more people involved in this pooled asset, for one thing. That's the way that it would work most feasibly. And second of all, this is an older model. The group plan actually predates the RESP and has been provided by a very limited number of providers, actually called scholarship trusts, some since the 1960s. So those are the three basic kinds of RESPs.
Yeah, I think we want to get back to the scholarship program a little later. There's a very interesting question here. A participant asks, I recently had a young parent tell me she went to Service Canada to get a SIN for her son specifically to open an RESP. But she was told she had to wait until he was 12 because they recently immigrated. Is this true?
Well, we don't know the circumstances of this family, but I think that the best thing that a service provider could do is actually read the information about the requirements for a social insurance number. Make sure that that parent has the information about the requirement for a social insurance number and see whether or not there is anything that might restrict their access to a SIN for the child. If not, then no, it's not true. And once again, we are faced with a counter-staff person who just needs a little bit more coaching on the importance of the social insurance number. By the way, if you go to www.smartsaver.org, you will find social insurance number information provided to us by Service Canada in 14 different languages, and that should help you out.
Let's put that website up one more time for our listeners. So let's move on to there's a lot of discourse in Ontario about reforming social assistance, and because social assistance and the rules around social assistance and welfare create so many disincentives. An RESP account opened by a social assistance recipient in Ontario, would that result in a clawing back of benefits?
No. And that's one of the things that I would definitely put it on the list of most common myths about RESPs, is that the Canada Learning Bond in an RESP has been exempted for a number of years now, has been exempted as an asset and as income for the purposes of calculating things like Ontario Works, ODSP, housing supports and other kinds of financial supports, and absolutely has been exempted from from the consideration of federal benefits.
Good. That's very clear. You've talked about automatic enrollment, that the federal government should simply, just the way, based on income tax returns, they send a check every month to people who qualify for the child tax benefit, that they should use that information to automatically open a learning bond for a family with children. Is this a costly recommendation?
Automatic enrollment? Mm-hmm. It is no more costly than full provision of the Canada Learning Bond, which is a statutory contribution. In fact, I guess I would argue that in some ways it could be cost-saving, because the approach that's being taken right now is to try to promote individual families to find out about these programs on their own, which has all kinds of inefficiencies to it. Basically, I would draw an analogy here between demand-side management and supply-side management. Basically, what we are doing right now, and through SmartSaver, what we are pursuing is a demand-side initiative, where we are trying to make sure that parents get the information so that they can make an informed choice to not only get the learning bond, but where they want to get it, and to invest it in the way that they believe would be most appropriate for their family. In a supply side management system, or in an automatic enrollment system, the government would not only get better coverage and make sure that the Canada Learning Bond actually started to achieve the potential impacts that it was possible of, but also it could do some other things to improve the quality of our ESP provision. It could pre-qualify where those Canada Learning Bonds were going to be housed, as an example, as a way, as Ontario did in choosing a pre-qualified RESP provider for children in care, to keep costs down and to streamline administration. I think that the UK Child Trust Fund provides a really good approach to ensuring that all children who are supposed to benefit from a program like the Canada Learning Bond actually do. The Child Trust Fund sent the parents the information that they needed, including like a little certificate that said your child is entitled to this benefit. The parents could then choose from a wide range of financial institutions where they wanted to take that certificate, and they could open up the account. And then, after 12 months, for any of the children whose parents had not taken the action of setting up the account, then the government would set up the account to make sure that none of the children actually missed their benefit. By having that sort of semi-voluntary process, but backstopping to make sure that children didn't actually get overlooked, the Child Trust Fund was able to achieve a 74% voluntary parental enrollment rate.
Wonderful.
That's a far cry from the Canada Learning Bond's 19% enrollment rate.
So here's a question after Maytree's heart, a question about protected people who are not yet landed immigrants. Sometimes it takes longer for people to move from one status to another. Do convention refugees, also called protected persons, qualify for the learning bond?
As long as they are entitled to a social insurance number.
And that could be the rub.
They can get the Canada Learning Bond.
Okay. I have a question around this group RESP idea. So technically it is possible for a community agency which works with a number of, let's say, low-income families, a mother's group or something. Technically it is possible for that agency to open up a group RESP for is it? It's my question to you, whether it's possible for a community agency, let's say like Pathways to Education, to open up a learning bond account, an RESP account for members of the community.
No.
No? Okay.
No. At present, the only people who can start an RESP, what they call become a subscriber to an RESP, are individuals. So organizations can't do that.
The Crown Ward, when, you know, the...
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay.
And more recently,
Okay.
yes, child welfare organizations.
Do you think there's a possibility of taking that policy lever of allowing institutions to open up a group RESPs? Is there a potential to expand this idea from Crown Wards to community agencies to neighborhood groups? I mean, you can see this happening in different ways.
I think we have a really great precedent in the form of the child welfare organizations, and I think it's a really good thought.
Let's go to hospitals. You know, I mean, I recently had a granddaughter, and when I was visiting there, I noticed all this literature lying around about enroll your child in a government-funded blah, blah, blah. And those products seem to have a different flavor to them. Can you talk about the products that are sold in hospitals to parents who are probably at their most excitable and therefore most vulnerable self?
Not to say sleep deprived.
Yes.
Yes. If I had one suggestion for hospitals, it would be make sure that in those kits of information that are provided to new parents, you include the government information on education savings and the Canada Learning Bond, and stop distributing the marketing packages for individual RESP providers unless you are very confident to yourself that the products that you are promoting through those packages are ones that are going to be of sort of accessible benefit to the families you're giving them to. As we have been out in the community and talking to a lot of parents, we have heard time and time again that parents first received information about RESPs at the time that their child was born. And while we think it is really important that parents start thinking about education savings when their child is born, we know also from what we've heard from them, from parents, that there's a lot of confusion. They get that information about one RESP provider or another from a hospital, and they think it's government information, and they sign up for a particular plan without doing any shopping around or comparison to see whether or not there are other options that might be more suitable for them, and that leads to difficulties in some cases. Parents getting themselves into agreements that weren't suitable for them.
I noticed in your introduction, May, that the Working Women Community Centre is listed as a partner, and I know that they're doing some work in the community. Can you describe what they're doing, and can you share with the audience how other settlement service providers can pick up on this work? Because 900,000 families across Canada, it has to grow. The work has to go beyond one immigrant serving agency.
It absolutely does. What is happening is SmartSaver was initiated as a 3-year pilot in Toronto only to test and evaluate different kinds of marketing, outreach, communication efforts to try to bring up the participation rate in the Canada Learning Bond. What we have committed to our funders, including HRSDC, the Education Savings Community Outreach Program, and a number of private foundations, public foundations, and for our community outreach work, the Ontario Trillium Foundation, which is supporting that work in our first piloting period. What we've committed to is trying things, potentially failing at some things, hopefully succeeding at some other kinds of approaches, and being able at the end of 3 years to provide better information to communities across the country on what were some of the triggers that really brought about improved our Canada Learning Bond enrollment. Toronto is not even the lowest participation rate in the country. even though we have a national take-up rate on the Canada Learning Bond of 19%. And Ontario is slightly lower than that. It's in the 18%. There are places in this country where the take-up rate is as low as 9-10%.
Where would that be, for example?
Manitoba, for instance, has been trailing.
Quebec?
Quebec is actually one of the highest,
highest
one of the higher participating provinces, as is BC.
Okay.
So we know that depending on the community that people are in and access to information, access to support, people may or may not even have heard of the Canada Learning Bond. So we are trying different things. Now, for our Toronto pilot, we started up as a 3-way community partnership. The Working Women's Community Centre, which has been with us since day one, to pilot in different low-income neighborhoods, to talk to families, to use some of their programs and their networks to reach families, to talk about, what do they know, what don't they know about the Learning Bond. And the YMCA of Greater Toronto, which is very involved in the 3-year pilot, because what they're doing is training in-house all of their child care centres and all of their newcomer services centres as a way for us to learn more about the needs of the professionals in terms of education needs, information and support needs, and also what's working and what's not working in terms of their approaches to families. Using their experience, then we can provide better support to other agencies. Working Women Community Centre's role is really to widen the net. They were at the Okazi conference a few weeks ago. They are in the local partnership and hub areas to talk to networks of agencies and try to beat the bushes, make sure people know what an RESP is, make sure they know what the Canada Learning Bond is, and if they want to drill down, and if they're ready to help their families to access free money, then they can pass them over to us, and we're ready to provide in-house training to frontline workers on how to go about encouraging Learning Bond enrollment.
That's wonderful. I certainly hope that jurisdictions outside of the GTA and certainly Ontario may pick up this call for action. We have a lot of conversation going on, clarifying comments from members of the audience, which I find very interesting. There are a number of questions around general education policy. I don't think we should get into those at this point, but there is a clarifying question around protected people again. And the question is around social insurance numbers starting with the number 9, which are typically granted by the Government of Canada to either convention refugees or temporary foreign workers. And the question again is, if your social insurance number, you have one, it starts with 9, can you open an RESP and qualify for a Canada Learning Bond?
I've never read anything that leads me to understand that there's any differentiation in social insurance numbers with respect to an RESP. If you have a social insurance number, you can start an RESP, and I don't believe that they distinguish, but we could certainly check that out.
We should check it out, because I think there might be some complexity in this.
I'm seeing a question here about whether or not people have to wait until they become permanent residents, and absolutely they do not. Temporary residents can secure the social insurance number, which allows them to secure the Canada Learning Bond. They do not have to be permanent residents.
So a temporary foreign worker who's in this country with a social insurance number that begins with 9, who's going to be in this country for 2 years, can technically take out a Canada Learning Bond. Can they take the proceeds to education outside the country?
Can they take the proceeds?
So they're not
the RESP is for children who are resident in Canada. If a family has to turn around and move somewhere else, the RESP will stay here, and the child would probably stop receiving the Learning Bond. A family could continue to contribute into it, and of course RESPs at the other end can be used very broadly, including outside of Canada.
As always, the devil lies in the details, doesn't it? So a last question. If you could say one thing to every Canadian family about the Learning Bond, what would it be?
You don't have to put money into an RESP in order to secure the Canada Learning Bond. This is absolutely the biggest confusion that families and service providers have about RESPs and the Learning Bond. The Learning Bond is free to access for eligible families. All you have to do is start an account. And it's not that hard to find an account that you can start at no cost and with no deposits and no contribution requirements whatsoever.
Thank you, May. I think the audience will all join me in congratulating Omega and May Wong on this stellar piece of work. Stellar because it identifies a nimble solution to systemic poverty. It's fact-based, it's evidence-based, and it provides practical, tangible suggestions for action. So I think we've all had a very informative 40-50 minutes. I want to thank my colleague Sandra Lokes for putting this together, and of course May and Omega Foundation. A publication will be coming out. We are getting nice comments on the website, and this will be available by podcast as well at some point.
The presentation will be online along with May's comments.
Yeah. Thank you all. Thank you, May. Thank you, Sandra. Goodbye.